Thank you all for coming. I'm generally used to presenting in somewhat smaller rooms to somewhat more technical audiences. So I'm hoping that some of the things that I learned back at the GSB will come back to me. So roughly what I'm going to be talking about today is going to be giving you kind of a primer on the most recent Nobel Prize in economics. So I don't know how many of you read about this. This was awarded a couple weeks ago. But it's actually very handy because this has made the sales pitch for some of my research much easier. I can just say, look, what I'm working on is kind of like what they just gave them the Nobel Prize for. So I'm going to start off by giving you guys a little bit of an overview about what is incentive contracting, because I think that economists use this word a little differently than managers tend to, and so I want to kind of get the terminology set up straight so that we all kind of understand what we're talking about. So the 2016 Nobel Prize in Economics was awarded to Oliver Hart and Bengt Holmstrom, and they were awarded it for essentially founding the theory of contracts in economics. And so I'm just going to excerpt a little bit from the Nobel Prize citation, which does a really good job giving kind of a high-level overview of what the hell they were working on and what they got the Nobel Prize for. So the citation starts off by saying, society's many contractual relationships include those between shareholders and top executive management, or for instance, a public authority and its suppliers. And such relationships typically entail conflicts of interest, and as a result, contracts have to be properly designed to ensure that the parties take mutually beneficial decisions. So this is essentially what the study of contract theory is all about, is studying these conflict of interest and how to resolve them to get good working relationships between two parties. And the citation goes on to say that this year's laureates have developed contract theory, which is a framework for analyzing many diverse issues in contractual design, like performance-based pay for top executives, among many other things. This is actually sort of underselling the work that they've done, because contract theory is very broad and considers questions like, what are the boundaries of the firm, what sort of relationship should be undertaken within a firm versus at arm's length contracts between different parties. I'm going to focus very narrowly, though, on this idea of incentive contracting within a firm between managers and employees. So this is sort of a high-level overview of what contract theory is all about from a very bird's-eye view. Now I'm going to zoom in a little bit and say more specifically, well, what do these kind of conflict of interest look like? What sort of problems do we expect to have when we hire someone and want them to do work for us? And then what kind of tools do we have to resolve it? And this is then going to set up some recent research that I've done. Unfortunately, I didn't do all of this research, but I've been more recently working on things that have sort of built on the framework that Holmstrom and Hart, among others, have provided to kind of study some more detailed problems that are a little bit more kind of realistic or bring in more of the features of a real firm environment. So broadly speaking, economists tend to divide incentive problems into two broad categories. And they're typically called moral hazard and adverse selection. You've probably heard these terms thrown around in a bunch of different contexts. They're kind of like historical terms that have applied to specific things and then have been generalized. So the terms don't really make a lot of sense just from first glance, but I'm going to explain what each of them is about and then how they sort of crop up in an environment in a firm when relationships between managers and employees. So first of all, moral hazard. This is something that got thrown around a lot during the financial crisis. I'm going to mean something slightly different from it than was used there. What I mean by moral hazard is essentially a case of what we're going to call in the literature hidden actions. And what that means essentially is that the employee's use of time can't be directly monitored by the manager. This is something where the manager hires someone to do work for them, they tell them to go off and do it, and there's some difficulty directly overseeing what it is that they're doing. And this could be either whether they're spending time working at all, or what choice of tasks they spend their time on, or something else. There's some friction there that prevents you from simply being a taskmaster and saying, do this, and now do this, and now do that. Now, why do we worry about that as managers? One of the big reasons that this is a problem is because employees might be lazy. They might prefer to shirk. They might be financially self-interested and try to skim off the financial resources of the firm in one way or another. And there are a lot of ways to embezzle money, as I think we all know. Or it might be more subtle. They might simply have a preferred division of their time between tasks. And even though they're working on things that they view as productive, these might not be the same things that the manager views as productive things to do. So these are all things that are going to be lumped under the category of moral hazard problems. And they're something that Bengt Holmstrom in particular spent a lot of time studying in firm environments. The second big category of incentive problems, I'm going to call it adverse selection. This came out of the insurance literature and the study of insurance markets. But this actually applies very generally. And as opposed to hidden actions where we're not really sure what the employee is doing, but we know what we want him to do, adverse selection is about asymmetric information. This is where the employee knows something about the task at hand, about the job or his fit for the job, that is actually relevant to what the manager wants him to do or whether he wants to hire him at all. And there would benefit from being some information sharing, but again, because of conflict of interest, this can be difficult. So just to give examples, classic adverse selection could be low quality workers that try to pass them off as skilled in order to get a job. So this is something where, if you think about efficiency and the best matching of workers to jobs, then you want workers with very specialized high quality skills to go with firms that can leverage those skills and lower quality workers to go elsewhere. But because of the conflict of interest, that generally those higher skilled jobs are also higher paid, many lower skilled workers will try to hide that information at the cost of efficiency. Another classic example, and actually the one that I'm going to be focusing on in my research that I'll explain to you today, is this last bullet point, that employees with conflicts of interest may misrepresent the viability of projects. So what I want you to have in mind for this is something where an employee benefits, for instance, from being put on a particular project. He's been given a pool of resources. He can work on something. He enjoys this for one reason or another. It may at some point be in the firm's best interest to reallocate resources to end this project or restructure things. But the employee doesn't want that because he's sort of built up something that he enjoys about this. Maybe it's the kind of people that he's managing. Maybe it's the tasks that he's working on. And he doesn't want things to end. And this is a problem if the employee is also the expert and knows when things should be overhauled or when they should be changed. So this is the sort of thing that can crop up with these sorts of conflicts of interest. And broadly speaking, this would all be kind of lumped into what adverse selection grew into in the literature, which is there's some information that's relevant to the task at hand that the employer wants the employee to give him, but it's sort of difficult because naturally the employee expects the employer might do something that's not in his own best interest. And these are sort of two things that contract theory and economics is trying to solve. This is very different, I think, from what we think of as designing contracts in, say, law, where that's very much about what's going to hold up in court and what sorts of things are enforceable. This is more about how do the terms and the way that you structure the employment agreement give the employee incentives to do things on his own because it's now in his best interest. So that's what we're really going to be kind of thinking about in this talk. So there are a bunch of tools that have been developed over time. I don't want to say economists developed these tools because they definitely didn't. They sort of systematized the study of these tools, but these are things that I think employers have discovered over thousands of years of managing employees, different things that can help with these problems. And I'm just going to briefly run down what are the different sorts of tools that can be used. In my project today, we're going to use a few of these tools, but not all of them. But just to give you kind of an overview, these are sorts of the kind of things that you might think about using in order to fix these incentive problems and get a more productive employment relationship. So the first thing you can do is you can use performance pay. So performance pay is probably the one that we're all most familiar with. This is sort of, you do a good job, we get good observable performance out of this project, and I give you a big bonus. At its extreme, this sort of becomes a theory of the firm type problem, because theory of the firm is all about what things should be done within the firm, what things should be sort of done in a contractual relationship. And ideally, if there's a conflict of interest, one way to resolve that conflict of interest is just to sell the whole project. To say, look, I'm hiring you to do this project for me. I'm literally going to make you residual claimant to all the profits and all the losses. You give me some amount of money up front, and I give you everything. That's certainly going to convince the employee to do whatever is in sort of the best interest of the project. The problem is either if the employee doesn't come in with enough capital to do this, or the employee is risk averse and doesn't want to take on that much personal financial risk, or there's sort of two-sided moral hazard where now you as the employer have things you have to contribute to the project, and now you don't want to because you've sold it to the employee. These are all reasons why we can't totally sell projects. But you can kind of do a little bit of the same thing, and this is what performance pay is if you want someone to care about how well the project is doing, well, you just directly tie their financial compensation to how well the project is doing. And this is a great solution if you can sort of directly observe the linkage between effort and outcome. So this is a classic sort of way to solve moral hazard problems. The trick here is that sometimes the link is very noisy. For instance, suppose that you're the CEO of a large firm. You have division managers handling different divisions of your firm. And you tell every division manager that their pay is going to be based on the sort of relative performance of their division versus some industry standard. Well, that's fine, except that there might be a lot of natural variability year to year in how this industry is doing, which means that you're now loading a lot of risk onto the employee that they might not want, because they might not be as rich as the firm and they might not be able to bear this risk. As a result, you're basically going to have to pay him some premium up front to be able to take on that risk, and maybe you don't want to pay that premium. So that sort of limits how much incentive pay you can use, but that's the basic idea of using incentive pay. Another classic thing is to use promotion or firing. You can think of promotion as either another form of incentive pay where you just defer the compensation until they get to the next level on the ladder, or as something where they may enjoy some of the other non-cash perks of the next position. Maybe they enjoy the increased autonomy or the sort of command of more employees they have, and so it acts as sort of a non-pecuniary reward that will still motivate them to work hard. And on the flip side, you can use firing as sort of a negative financial consequence to them to try to get them to do what you want. So these are all ways to resolve the sorts of moral hazard problems that you might worry about if you can't directly monitor their activities. Another thing that's proposed often by economists and is not used very often in employment contracting, but is very prevalent in some other sorts of contracts, are what I'm going to call menus of contracts. So what I want you to keep in mind for this is you're going to pick your health insurance plan. And usually, in many cases now, you have a choice of plans. And they'll give you 2 or 3 or even 4 different options for what plan you want to choose. This is effectively a menu of contracts where different people will self-select into whatever contract they see is in their best interest. Now, this can be useful for resolving asymmetric information problems because you can then extract some of the information that these employees hold about their kind of private benefit. For instance, in healthcare, you might be trying to extract how risky are they, like what's their expected healthcare expenditure, something like that. By kind of writing different contracts, you can figure out who's going to choose each contract and then price them accordingly. Of course, there are some limits to that because if you choose contracts that are totally exploiting the information, then no one is going to actually choose that contract, so you have to kind of strike a balance. But this sort of menu of contracts idea is one way to encourage information sharing. Another circumstance in which it's sometimes proposed to be used, very occasionally used in Silicon Valley, but I don't see it very often, is people worry a lot about whether employees are incentivized more by sort of hard compensation, cash, or by a stake in the firm, so like equity in the firm. And there have been a few firms I've heard about in Silicon Valley that will actually offer either option. You can have kind of like an equity heavy or an equity light employment contract. And this can be another way to sort of try to sort out which employees are motivated by one thing or another. Now, ideally, what would be a really cool thing to see would be that the employees that reveal themselves to be sort of more or less staked in the firm by that would also be given different duties. I don't think you generally see that, or if you do see it, you actually see it at the firm level, where firms that expect their employees to be more vested in the interests of the firm are sort of all given high equity contracts and all work together in one firm. And then another firm, they just have the people that are there for the wage and they go select in that firm. Arguably, that's also a way to implement this menu of contracts while also dealing with firm culture problems that might prevent people with very different contracts from coexisting right next to each other. But this is sort of an idea that you can use to try to improve the performance of the employment relationship. And then there are a couple other things you can do. Procedural rules will actually turn out to be very important in the project I'm going to tell you about today. And this is sort of an idea where you have a bureaucracy and you have procedures you have to follow in this bureaucracy. For instance, you might have a seniority-based promotion policy, or you might have rules about what kind of bonuses you can give and what they're going to be linked for. Or if you're thinking about allocation of capital to division managers, you might require that division managers give you particular types of proposals in order to be able to get the capital. And these kind of rules, you might want to bend them in particular instances, ex post, but when you go in and you write these rules, they may prevent certain kinds of incentive problems from occurring. And indeed, we'll see that procedural rules that sort of set deadlines for how long projects can last in firms can be a really important tool for solving particular kinds of incentive problems. And of course, the last thing, which I think is often the first thing people think of doing, is simply directly monitoring. That if you're worried that your employee is going to shirk or that they're going to be doing the wrong things, well, then you as the manager should just go in and watch and make sure they're not doing that. And I think very often in many firms, this is more or less the way that it's solved, is kind of throwing more people at it to watch what other people are doing. And what I'm going to try to convince you today is that because that's clearly very costly from the standpoint of your time as a manager, that there can be maybe other ways you can do this so that you don't have to watch them so carefully. And that's what the theme of today's talk is about. It's sort of alternatives to this direct costly monitoring. Because we know you can always do that, but there are sometimes other things you can do as well that don't require any day-to-day investment of time on your part once you've figured out what the right contracting structure is. So that's given you kind of a high-level overview of what are sort of the things that economists are thinking about when we talk about contract theory, and what are the sorts of hammers that we use to hammer down these nails. And now I'm going to focus very specifically on a project that I've been working on for the last year or so, that's looking at a specific type of incentive problem that I think is prevalent in certain types of employment relationships. So I'm going to pose the problem to you. I'm going to pose it very starkly as a sort of hypothetical case study. It's not going to be about real firms or based on real things, but it's going to be kind of highlighting the sorts of incentive problems I have in mind, and hopefully you'll agree that this has some application in the real world. And then I'll put some specific numbers that are sort of reasonable, but again, conjectural on this. And then I'll show how to write an incentive contract that can kind of improve on the problems that would be had if you just sort of let those conflict of interest as given and tried to work without a contract. So what I'm going to be talking about is about managing temporary projects. And so what do I have in mind by this? I'm going to give you a very stylized sort of hypothetical case study that's going to say exactly what the problem is that we're going to be solving here. So here's the case study. A consultancy, MBB, no relation to any real world firms, is engaged by a firm, PG, also no relation to any large Fortune 500 companies, to make proposals for cutting costs and adopting industry best practices. Both MBB and PG are going to be uncertain about the scope for improvements. They both are going to expect that there are going to be some improvements to be made, but they don't know how long the project should go on for or how much work is going to be needed to find and implement these improvements. The catch is that MBB has done this sort of work before. They're an expert. They've done this for a bunch of other firms. They're going to probably be able to tell when the project has become economical, when you've sort of hit the point where all the things that you can implement have been implemented. So they're really in the best position to go and tell PG, okay, I think we're done here. I think we've done everything that there is to be done. With the obvious caveat that MBB is effectively paid by the hour, or paid by some other increment of time that may not be tied very closely to how many improvements are actually being made to the firm's profitability, or how worthwhile it is to continue running the project for another 6 months. So the question is, can we use incentive contracting, as I've kind of broadly described it, to encourage information sharing and increase project returns? So can PG do better than just hiring MBB on an at-will basis and then deciding for itself based on the results that it's seen so far when to end the project? So now I'm going to present to you a toy model, and this is often the way, I'm an economic theorist, and this is the way things are done in economic theory, is we write down things very specifically with kind of numbers on all the variables. It's obviously always going to be a little too stylized to apply to any one particular circumstance, but I'm putting numbers on these to actually work through this exercise to give you some results and to kind of show in a more concrete rather than abstract way that this can do good in certain situations. So I'm going to assume just some kind of basic things about the numbers that are going to be relevant for this. First of all, PG and MBB are both going to have an internal rate of return of 5% a year, so they're just going to discount future profits a little bit. I'm going to assume that MBB's team is going to charge $40K a month, and that they're going to make a profit margin 50% on that. So 50% of the charge is for airfare and hotels and things they don't really care about, and then 50% is basically the fees that they're receiving as a firm after all the expenses. Each major improvement is going to be worth $1 million to PG. So if they can find something that needs to be done that will increase their operations, then this is quite valuable relative to the kind of flow cost of employing MBB. But it takes a while to find those improvements. And I'm going to assume, roughly speaking, that major improvements are found on average every 6 months until the project lapses. Now, I make a specific assumption in my paper about the actual distribution of this. On average, it's going to be every 6 months. It could be shorter. It could be longer. And I just assume a very simple distribution that kind of makes everything very straightforward to solve. But just think about this as roughly, improvements come at a random rate, but on average, they come once every 6 months. And then I'm going to assume that the average time until the project lapses is about 1.5 years. So this is going to be about as long as it takes for whatever division of PG is being worked on to kind of do all the work that needs to be done. But again, this could be random. It could be that there really aren't that many improvements to be made, or that difficulties within the firm make it so that those don't apply to PG. Or it could be that this is actually a long project and there's a lot to be done, but it takes more time. And this is going to be the difficulty, is that PG is going to want to employ MBB to make these improvements, but it's going to be hard for it to tell when things have been exhausted and when it's time to cut ties with this project. And these numbers are just to kind of give you a sense. They're all kind of reasonable-ish toy numbers to pick. You could pick different ones and you'd get basically the same results, qualitatively speaking. So the first thing that I'm going to ask is about at-will employment. So we can first say, how much profit can PG make by employing MBB without an incentive contract? And by this I mean, you employ them, the contract says every month that we keep working for you, I'm going to pay you $40,000, or sort of I'm going to pay your expenses, which are $20,000, and then pay you another $20,000 for all of the wages for the bodies that you're putting on this project. And I can decide at any time when to end it, and there are going to be no other incentive payments. And that's going to be the way that this baseline contract is going to work. So obviously this is going to create a big problem for information sharing because MBB is clearly just going to straightforwardly earn more money the longer the project runs. So it's never going to tell PG any information that would lead to the project ending prematurely. Now, I think a common rejoinder to this is that if MBB is anything like any unrelated firms, then it's going to care about its reputation in the industry. It's going to want to potentially have a long-lived relationship with this firm and have follow-on engagements. This can give it some incentive to not misreport and to not let the project drag as long as possible because they care about their future relationship with the firm. This is actually a very deep branch of the literature that thinks about these sorts of things. That is often a way that you can sustain these sorts of relationships, but it's tricky. Everyone has to sort of understand that this is going to be happening for a while. There can't be changeovers in management that mean that the ties that you have are broken. It's often a very fragile way to sustain these sorts of things. And if you can write an incentive contract to do it instead, why not do that rather than sort of relying on these trust-based relationships in all cases? That's not to say that sometimes trust isn't the best way to do it. I think many of the most important relationships are formed based on trust rather than on contracts. But in the real world, this isn't always the ideal case, and then contracting can help you. So we're going to assume that if in the short run you can gain more by prolonging the project, MBB is going to do it. And so there's going to be no information sharing here. So PG is going to end the project after a sufficiently long dry spell. If you think about it from the PG's perspective, they're trying to learn about how likely it is that the project has been exhausted by now. The longer it goes without having MBB having found any improvements for them, the more pessimistic they are that it's still good, because if it were still good, they'd be finding something occasionally. Eventually, when it's gone long enough without any improvements, then they're going to say, okay, well, we're going to cut the project now. In order to actually compute what their best termination policy is, this is actually a real option valuation problem. There's probably a couple classes in the operations department at Booth that will teach you how to do that. I'm not going to go into those details here. They're pretty quantitative and essentially mathematical. But I've already solved it for you, and I will tell you what the kind of optimal project length is for them. And it turns out, given the numbers that I've given, it should operate the project for about 17 months until no improvements have been found. This may sound like a long time, but even though on average an improvement comes every 6 months, with the distribution I'm assuming, it's not too unlikely that maybe it takes a year and a half to really have the improvements kick in and show that they've been doing something useful. So think about this as sort of 17 months when not only have they not proposed anything, but anything that they've proposed sort of hasn't really worked out, and it feels like they're just kind of making up things for them to do. And then you can figure out what's the NPV of this project given this sort of decision about when to terminate it. And it turns out that PG is going to make about $1.5 million. And this is their net profit after all the fees that they've paid to MBB. So that's fine, good. We're making a fair amount of money off of this. The question is whether we can do any better by resolving this incentive problem and getting some information. Because clearly, when we do things this way, we're going to make some mistakes. And there are going to be two kinds of mistakes that PG is going to make operating the project this way. The first is that they might terminate the project too early. That they might say, look, I saw 17 months have gone by, there was no improvement, seems unlikely that this is still worth doing, I'm going to terminate it, and then maybe 3 months later a big improvement would have come along. So that's one kind of mistake that they're going to make, is this sort of premature termination decision. The other kind of mistake that they're going to make is running the project too long. So saying, okay, well, maybe the project actually lapsed after a year or something like that, but their rule told them to go on. This was sort of the best that they could do on average. But if they had known what MBB knew, then they wouldn't have run the project this long. So these are the sort of two sorts of mistakes they're going to make. If there were perfect information sharing, they could avoid making both sorts of mistakes because they could just trust MBB's recommendation about how long to operate the project. You don't even have to assume that MBB knows perfectly. As long as they have sort of a better idea than PG about how long to run the project, then there's still gains in both directions. So the question is how well we're going to be able to do with info sharing and whether we can sort of profitably extract this information to eliminate both kinds of mistakes that PG might make. So this is at-will employment, and this is the baseline that we're going to compare several kinds of incentive contracts with. And then I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes talking about incentive contracts that don't really work. They're going to encourage information sharing. They're going to solve this problem, but they're going to create another problem that they're going to pay MBB way too much. And they're going to pay MBB so much that they would have been better off just not giving them any incentive pay at all and just kind of eating the losses. And part of why I included this is just how the numbers for this particular example worked out. And I thought about whether I should try to find different numbers where it wasn't this case. But then I thought that's actually a really important lesson that, look, we spend a lot of time as economists thinking about these sorts of issues. It is true that they can help, but you have to do it right. You can do incentive contracting poorly in a way that doesn't help you. And the next couple slides are going to be about incentive contracts that don't work. But they're going to be important ways to understand how an incentive contract that does work operates. So even though these next ones are not going to be things that we're going to recommend PG implement, they're going to give you some of the mechanics. So you can learn about, okay, what sorts of things are we going to do? What levers are we pushing to try to motivate them to share information with us? I had a list of sort of various kinds of incentive tools that might be used in different sorts of environments. Now I'm going to drill down and say, in the environment that we have here, what things can we deploy in order to try to encourage information sharing? And it turns out there are going to be three sorts of things that we can use. One is going to be what I'm going to charitably call a completion bonus, although you might as well call it a golden parachute or sort of a payment for failure, because it's going to be something that you pay them when the project ends early rather than late. Deadlines for how long we're going to allow the project to run. And then what I'm going to call merit extensions, which are going to be pretty straightforward. They're going to be, look, when we see improvements, we're going to essentially reconsider the length of the contract and maybe put more time on the clock for this project. Now I want to emphasize that I'm considering a particular kind of employment contract, which in the literature we would call a contract under commitment. And what that means is that if we say in the contract, this is a 17-month or a 20-month or a 2-year project, then when we hit that mark and we've promised in the contract that this is going to terminate, then we're actually going to do that. Now this is clearly a problem in some cases in the real world, because if you've designed something where you think that you're getting good information sharing, MBB is telling you the project is still good, and you've hit this deadline where you said you were going to terminate, there's a really strong incentive for you as a firm to go back and say, okay, well, let's ignore that number. We're going to renegotiate this whole contract, and we're going to keep going. The trick with that is that once you've done that and you've lost that credibility, now you've destroyed the incentives for good information sharing. So if a firm cares about its reputation for sort of doing what it says it's going to do in its contracts, then it's going to prefer to commit to these sorts of things and not renegotiate even when it hits those points. And this is obviously going to apply better in some environments than others. But I just want to emphasize, and not sweep this under the rug, that one of the things that's really important here is that firms do what they say they're going to do in these contracts. That if you go back and you renegotiate them, and you could think about renegotiating any of these things. Maybe you renegotiate the deadline and extend it. Maybe you decide to renege and not pay the completion bonus and say, okay, well, go sue me and see what you can get out of me. We'll say that you didn't do the work that you said you were going to do, something like that. You can think of a lot of ways that they would renege on these. And I'm going to assume for the moment that they don't. And we're going to see what can you do if you can credibly commit not to renege. And maybe one of the lessons that I want you guys to learn from this is that I think there's a lot of temptation as managers to think about there being changing circumstances where you said something in a contract, it seemed reasonable at the time, but circumstances have changed and now you're going to do something different. And maybe that makes sense if actually the circumstances were unforeseen. But if what you're really doing is saying that you don't want to commit yourself in the instance to something you said you were going to do in order to set up good incentives, then you've now destroyed those incentives. So the fact that you don't do that is going to be really important for what's going to happen in the next few contracts. So what I'm going to do is basically present 3 contracts, each of which employs one or more of these, and we're going to kind of add one on at a time. So first I'm going to show what happens when we use completion bonuses. Then I'm going to show what if we add on deadlines to those completion bonuses. And then I'm going to say what if in addition we use merit extensions. And it's going to turn out that it's not going to be sufficient to use either 1 or 1 and 2, but once we use 1, 2, and 3 together, then we can actually get something on top of the kind of baseline of at-will employment. So let's look at this. This is going to be a contract with info sharing. All of these contracts are going to be properly structured to convince MBB that it's in its best interest to report when the project should end. They're obviously not always going to be in the best interest of PG to write a contract like this, but we're going to have solved this incentive problem, maybe at the cost of introducing a profitability or a viability problem. But this is how it's going to work. So here's a proposed contract. PG is going to promise MBB a completion bonus of $5.9 million if the project is ever terminated. This sounds like a huge completion bonus, and it is. It's clearly not going to be profitable for them to offer that kind of bonus. You can just kind of figure out if you earn $1 million on average once every 6 months for like a year and a half, there's no way that on average you're going to get $5.9 million out of it. So where do I come up with this number? This number is exactly how much it takes for MBB to not care anymore how long the project operates. If you take their operating profit of 20K a month, and you use the internal rate of return of 5%, and you say, let's suppose I give you an annuity that pays out that forever, then what's going to be the net present value of that annuity? It should be, unless I did something terribly wrong, something on the order of $5.9 million. So if I say, look, whenever the contract ends, I'm going to give you this huge pot of money, then you could say, look, it could have lasted forever, and I wouldn't have done any better than this. And so I might as well just take this money now, and then I'm going to tell you truthfully whenever the project should end. And so PG is committed to this huge payment. It's going to regret it, turns out, committing to it, but it's committed to it. And so given that it's committed to it, it understands that MBB is reporting truthfully. So it's never going to terminate the project before MBB tells it to. And so it's just going to wait, and it's going to keep going, confident that it's gotten the incentives right, which it has. And then it's going to terminate as soon as MBB says that the project is lapsed and that it's not economical to run it anymore. Okay, so a result from just doing the math on this. The project's MPV to PG is minus 2.2 million. So as we sort of guessed just from seeing the huge size of this number, there are ways to do incentive contracting really badly, which is if we just focus monomaniacally on trying to get rid of this incentive problem, we can end up paying way too much money for it. And this is what happens in this case. So this isn't even a remotely viable contract, but it's giving us a little bit of a sense for what kind of things do we have to think about. So here, the reason that we were able to get MBB to information share is we said, look, we understand that they look forward to this annuity of whatever their profits after expenses were from operating this project. If we just promise to pay them that when the project ends, they'll no longer have an incentive to try to hold on to that stream longer. So the next step is to say, well, but that's a really big income stream. How do we limit it? And the obvious way to limit it is to put a deadline on the project so that the expectation now, if they let the project go on, isn't that it'll go on forever and that they can collect 20K a month for the rest of their lives. But instead to say, well, maybe they expect it to run for 2 years, and that really limits the value to them of holding on because now it's just not worth as much to them. So this is going to be the second contract that I'm going to propose. So now we've added on completion bonuses. And as I mentioned before, you might as well call this paying for failure because what we're doing is we're actually paying you a bonus when things have gone bad and we want you to go away. So it's more like a golden parachute than it is like an incentive payment to get someone to do something quickly. It looks kind of similar, but it's operating on a very different margin. So now we're going to add on, this was sort of step one, was to add completion bonuses. Now we're going to add step two, which is we're going to put deadlines on top of the completion bonuses to hopefully sort of stem the blood loss that we have from giving these big incentive payments to MBB. So here's a different proposed contract. And this number is going to seem arbitrary at first, and I'll tell you in a moment why I chose it. So PG is instead going to commit to a project horizon of 33 months. And so again, this is something where it's really important that MBB expect that if they hit this project horizon, they'll actually terminate the project no matter what. And further, PG is going to make a promise. Rather than saying, I'm just going to give you a lump sum 5.9 million payment, regardless of how long or when we decide to terminate the project, they're going to promise that if the project is ended n months before the horizon, then MBB is going to earn a completion bonus equal to the MPV of average billings minus expenses for n months. Now, if you think back to the previous slide, this is actually exactly what we were doing on the previous slide, except that the horizon was infinite. So under an infinite horizon, no matter when you terminate, then the NPV of your earnings is going to be 20K a month forever. And so that's the payment we were giving them. It looked like it was just a static payment, but it was really sort of making sure that they were getting the right payment at every moment in time, no matter when things go bad. Here, things get a little more complicated because intuitively, the closer you get to the horizon, the sort of smaller the incentive problem becomes. That now if MBB hangs on for a couple more months when it's 2 months before the horizon, they really don't have that much to earn. So they're willing to accept a pretty small payment in order to say that things have gone bad, say at month 30. On the other hand, if they come in and they discover after 4 or 5 months that really like this division of PG is really screwed up in ways that they're not really going to be able to solve, then they have a lot to lose by coming out and saying, look, we can't help you with this. And so they're going to need a much bigger incentive payment in order for that to work. And clearly the way that I have it set up here, we've got it just right so that MBB is willing to report truthfully because again, they sort of expect to earn the same amount of money no matter how long the project operates. In particular, I've set it up so that the NPV of MBB's earnings is independent of the project length, and therefore they're going to be willing to share their information. And then if you think about, so PG is committed itself to this horizon and it's committed itself to the bonus scheme. It can't wiggle out of those. And in fact, it's not going to want to. But it still has freedom to decide when it's going to end the project. And because it knows that MBB is reporting truthfully, it's again going to wait until MBB tells it to end the project. It's never going to, it sort of knows that there's truthful reporting of the state of the project, so there's no reason why they would disregard MBB's advice. But then they're bound where if you hit 33 months, then they kind of throw up their hands and say, sorry, we have to abide by what we wrote down. So the reason I chose 33 months here is that you can think about all the contracts that look like this over kind of a bunch of different choices of the horizon. And then you can do an optimization problem, which I've sort of done for you behind the hood, to figure out what's the best horizon that they can choose if these are the only tools available to us. And it turns out that 33 months with the numbers that I chose is going to be the best horizon. So this is sort of just under 3 years. But remember that that's actually not how long the project is typically going to run. It could only run a couple months before MBB says we're just totally ill-suited to this. Could run a year and a half. But 33 months is as long as it could possibly run, although it won't hit it that often. And then the result is that the project's MPV for PG with this incentive contract is about 1.5 million. So to remind you of when we were using at-will employment, we also got that we were earning about 1.5 million. It actually turns out this 1.5 million is slightly smaller. I'm rounding here because this is a toy example, so it's sort of the numbers shouldn't be that precise anyway. But actually, we're not doing any better. We spent a lot of time thinking about how to do incentive contracting. We've set up complicated incentives or complicated commitment devices that we're going to have to abide by. And so if we have any worries about that, then that's going to be difficult for us. And we're not doing any better than we were with no contract at all. So this is getting a little bit disheartening that, OK, we've taken this academic perspective at heart that we should care about solving these incentive problems with contracts. And we've tried to do a couple things. We've tried to add on completion bonuses that are big enough to get MBB to give us good advice. And that didn't work. That worked terribly. We lost a bunch of money, and we probably got fired for doing that. And then we said, OK, well, let's be a little smarter about it. Now we're going to put some deadlines on, make the contract even more complicated. And we're still not doing any better. So this feels like it's a little bit demoralizing, and maybe this isn't everything that I promised it's going to be. But we have one more tool available, which is that so far all we've done is we've promised sort of static things. We've said, look, here's this horizon, and it's a fixed horizon. And here's this payment, and it's going to be pegged to what they tell us in a particular way. But it's not going to be kind of malleable to any of the facts on the ground. But there are some facts on the ground. That remember that when we hired MBB, we do get some information about how the project is going, which is the rate at which these improvements arise. And so the last thing to keep in mind is, well, maybe we can do better than this by adapting what happens in the contract to what we see as the project operates. And it's going to turn out that that's going to be the sort of secret sauce that's going to make incentive contracting beneficial to us over at-will employment. So here I'm going to propose one more contract. They're going to commit to a project horizon. This is going to be shorter than it was before. So in the last contract, I claimed that 33 months was sort of the optimal horizon given that structure of contract. Here we're going to shorten it. We're going to say 20 months, so a little shorter than 2 years. But it's going to be flexible. And we're going to say that we're going to reset this horizon every time you deliver us a major improvement. And this is going to be a complete reset. So if you come to us in month 18 and you say, look, here, there's an improvement, then we're going to say, OK, we're going to put 20 more months on the clock. That we're going to kind of wipe out everything that's happened before and start fresh from 20 months again. And that's true regardless of how close to the deadline we are when they deliver an improvement. And then they're going to use completion bonuses as usual. And we're by now pretty familiar with how these are structured. And basically the idea is that we have to take whatever MBB would have expected to get by simply never saying anything. And we're going to have to pay them that up front. Now, remember here that once the project is lapsed, there are no more improvements. And so even though we have these merit resets, they don't apply to MBB once the project is lapsed. And so we still know that if the project lapses n months before the horizon, they know that if they don't say anything, that's exactly how much longer they're going to get paid for. So we can use the same sort of completion bonuses that we were using in the last two contracts, which are just making sure that they feel like they're not any worse off with the project ending early versus later. And so again, it's no longer going to be true that MBB is going to make the same amount of money regardless. In the last two contracts, that was actually true. That no matter what actually happened during the project, MBB made the same amount of money. Here, actually, the longer the project goes, the better it is for MBB, because you have these merit resets. So every time an improvement occurs, you get more time on the clock, and that increases the expected amount of time that MBB is going to get to be employed. And so they actually do make more money from it going longer. But what's important is that once the project is lapsed, then they have to not benefit by waiting a bit longer or a lot longer to misreport. And so that's what's the key for understanding why this promotes information sharing, is that even though their earnings might vary depending on what happens in the project, it doesn't vary in a way that makes them want to withhold or delay reporting that the project has lapsed. And so here we have some good news, is that finally incentive employment is working for us. That now the project's MPV for for PG, a firm unrelated to any Fortune 500 firm, with this incentive contract is 1.8 million. And another result, which I'm very far from actually showing you guys here, but this is sort of part of what my work on this project was about, is showing that this is actually PG's most profitable incentive contract. And I could actually take any set of numbers that I gave you at the beginning and even add some more embellishments to the model and show you that even in that more general setting, this is the right form for this incentive contract. That it's going to use these three things in tandem. That we're going to use completion bonuses, which are going to be the way that we're going to prevent MBB from wanting to hang on to a dying project. We're going to use deadlines to limit the damage to us, to sort of limit the expected gain that MBB is going to have from lying to us for a long period of time. And then we're going to use merit resets to make sure that we still get some of the upside from operating the project. That if you impose a really severe deadline to staunch the losses from these payments, well, you're not going to really get much benefit out of the engagement to begin with because you're going to have to terminate it pretty quickly. So these merit resets are basically allowing us to say, well, we're going to relax the incentives exactly when it's okay for us to do so. That when we're getting improvements, we know that the project is good. This is sort of independent confirmation that things are still going well. And so there's no incentive problem for extending the project then. And so it's these three things together that get us an improvement over at-will employment. So just to remind you guys in terms of the numbers of how this ended up working out, so at-will employment gave us 1.5 million from this engagement. And if this seems unrealistically low or unrealistically high, depending on which firms you're thinking about, which projects, if you scale the numbers up and down, then these will all sort of go through in the same proportions. So this could be 10 million or 100 million, or it could be 500,000, depending on what you want to apply it to. And what we found is that just bonuses was terrible, that we actually lost a ton of money doing that. Bonuses and deadlines kind of just about broke even. It was a little bit worse, and we did a bunch of work designing the contract, and so that wasn't that great for us either. But actually doing all three of these got us a 15% improvement in the profitability of this project, which is not bad. And if you choose different numbers that increase the scope of the incentive problem, then you can sometimes get even more benefit from solving it. So this is trying to give you an idea. And the problem with being a theorist is that I have a lot of great ideas. And just like no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy, many of these things work much better on paper with all these clean assumptions than they do in reality. But what I'm trying to emphasize is two things. One is that incentive contracting can help, that there are instances in which if this is a conflict of interest, and you write a contract that solves it, then you can gain from, as an employer from doing that. The other thing is that you have to be careful about doing it smartly. And I think there have been sort of periods of time, for instance, with sort of high-powered incentives where executives are given big option grants and things like that, where people get really excited about a particular idea, a particular way of structuring incentive pay. And then they don't think about the consequences of it. And it turns out that if you do it poorly, that can be worse than not doing it at all. And I mean, one thing people were worried about with these big stock grants to executives in the 90s was that, well, now you're giving them a bunch of optionality. So you're not just giving them stock, you're giving them these options. And because of the convexity of options, you actually want to take on a bunch of risk. That the executives don't get any of the downside, they get all the upside, so they're going to want to take on very risky projects. And that's an example of what can sometimes be a very poorly structured incentive scheme. And so the other thing I want to emphasize here is that, yeah, it's actually, if you're going to do it, you want to make sure to take the time to do it right. And my understanding is that there are actually in kind of consulting firms that think about structuring these contracts. And I have no idea whether they're worth any of the money that people pay to them. But I can at least see why there's a reason for it, because it's true that you have to be careful about it, or you can do things that cost you a lot of money when you didn't expect them to, or that actually incentivize all the wrong behavior. So before I go on to kind of talk about a few other general lessons that we can get out of this sort of study, I want to add one more embellishment onto the model, because there's something that was actually quite unrealistic about this setup that can easily be kind of generalized in other settings, which is I assumed that these improvements were in this very stark black and white world, where if the project was good, then you got improvements at a particular rate, and if the project was bad, then you got no improvements. And as a result, every time we got an improvement, this was sort of perfect verification that we were still doing okay. And we could have these merit resets completely reset the horizon. But you might expect in a more realistic example that the waters are a little muddier. That when things are good, you're getting a pretty steady rate of improvement. And then you sort of start to reach the end of the road, you're wringing the last few drops of water from the towel. And you might still occasionally get improvements, but they're just not coming along as often. And it turns out that adds another wrinkle that you have to solve in order to really see incentive contracting work for you in this environment. So this case, which I'm just going to cover in thumbnail sketch, is contracting with what I'm going to call ambiguous news. So here the idea is when you get an improvement, that's still good news for you about the project. It kind of increases your beliefs that the project is doing well, but it's not unambiguous. So you still have some doubts that maybe it's going badly and they just got lucky. So here merit extensions, where they were kind of a godsend to us before, and it was obvious that once you get this news, you should totally reset it. This never hurts incentives because once the project is lapsed, then MBB is never going to see any more improvements. Here's a double-edged sword. The pros are the same as they were before, that you could decrease premature project termination by sort of extending the lifeline of the project when it's doing well. But the cons are that it's actually going to increase the payments that you need to give to MBB. The reason being, all the completion bonuses that we structured in the contract so far said, okay, we're going to pay you the NPV of your profits up until the bonus, or up until the horizon has been hit. And because we weren't going to get any improvements, how much we increased the horizon with merit extensions didn't matter to us. But now there are going to be a few merit extensions that might occur on average, even when the project is lapsed. And so the more extensions you give for those merit extensions, the kind of longer you extend the project when you get these improvements, then the more MBB is going to look at this fee and say, you know, this isn't that great, I'm going to get lucky, or I might get lucky some of the time, and so I'm better off just holding on. And so we're going to have to give them even bigger payments in order to prevent them from holding on. And so you have to balance this, where you want some merit extensions because you want to get more of the upside of a long-lived project, but you don't want too big a merit extension, or you're just going to end up not getting any savings to the fees that you're going to have to give MBB. So good incentive contracting is then going to have to strike a balance between these forces. It turns out, qualitatively speaking, that what happens is a very natural and intuitive thing, which is when you're near the beginning of the project, you don't rely very heavily on merit extensions. You sort of don't infer very much from this news because you know it's probably good anyway. But if you're very far into the lifetime of the project, then you actually give very big merit extensions because it's actually very good news about the project that things are still going well after a long time. And then the one result that I can give you that's reassuring is that even in this environment where the news is ambiguous, if you write just the right incentive contract, there exists some contract that is going to improve over at-will employment. That if you use the combination of these three tools, you will do better than if you didn't. So that's good news. And then the details of that are a little bit complicated, so I've sort of abstracted from them in this talk, but these are the sorts of things that you would be thinking about when you're trying to design these contracts in practice. Okay, so now I'm going to try to give a few high-level lessons for managers. I've sort of guessed at what I think the most useful takeaways would be, and if we get some time to talk after, or some questions after the talk, I'd love to be educated on what the actual takeaways are from this. But these are some things I think would be useful to keep in mind from the talk at a high level. So first is just getting back to the basic question of how can you improve the outcome of temporary projects? There are sort of three things that you should consider doing. The first is you should commit to project horizons rather than open-ended engagements. And by this I mean really committing to the point where everyone is actually going to expect that even if you were kind of convinced by MBB that things should go on for a while longer, that your hands are tied by bureaucracy or some sorts of rules. So this is actually an instance in which firm bureaucracy can be good rather than bad, and that it can prevent people from getting screwed up incentives in these sorts of engagements. The second is you should pay for failure. And the third is that you should be responsive to observable milestones, but if the news is ambiguous, not too responsive. I want to talk for a moment about assumption 2, because I think this is something that's probably very uncomfortable to a lot of people. And the reasoning you probably go through in your head when you say this is, hey, well, I don't just worry when I employ MBB that they're going to tell me how long the project should last for. I also want them to work hard on this project. And if I pay them so much that they don't care anymore whether the project is actually operating or dead, whether we're going to be laid off right away or we're going to continue, then maybe they're just not going to work very hard on the project. And this is actually a big concern, and it's something that I'm doing some follow-on research on. And so this is sort of combining two things. So far, this project has been totally about asymmetric information, the sort of second point that I brought up in incentive problems. This is adding on a moral hazard component, which is what if we can't actually observe how hard MVB is working? Maybe if they know that slacking off just means they get a big completion bonus, they show up to the office every day, they open up a bunch of Excel spreadsheets and go ask people for numbers, and then they don't do anything with it, then they clearly don't want to be incentivizing that kind of behavior. And there, actually, you do worry about a little bit about this. In particular, you worry about the following thing. Suppose that you're near a deadline, and there's sort of not very much time left to come up with an improvement. So MVB knows that they're probably going to get laid off pretty soon regardless. Then they're going to have very little incentive to actually work, and you're going to get a period where they're actually going to be shirking on the job. And then you have to, in order to design a good incentive contract, you have to kind of decide how much you are willing to balance those off. That if you're going to get better information sharing and you're going to use this information well, you're going to encourage some shirking near the end of the lifetime of the project. It's actually not going to be so much of a problem early on in the project, because as long as you're using merit extensions, those extensions happen more often when the project is doing well than when it's doing poorly. So you're going to want to work to get those improvements for the merit extensions. But if there just isn't much scope for improvement left, then you're just going to shirk. And I haven't quite figured out under what circumstances this is going to kind of, one thing is going to go one way or the other, but this is sort of the complexity of real life contracts versus these toy models, is that you have a lot of different things to think about. So I say pay for failure with a caveat that if you really think the main problem is information sharing, then definitely pay for failure so that people aren't afraid to give you bad news. But if you're also really worried about these moral hazard problems, about them actually exerting effort, and that's actually the bigger problem for you, then you might just be willing to accept that information sharing doesn't happen in order to get them to work hard. And these are the sort of things that as a real manager you have to deal with, that I as a theorist can say that I abstract from this concern, and everyone is like, this is good. We focus on one thing so we understand it better. And the other is I just wanted to talk for 5 minutes or so about, in general, if you're a manager and you're setting up a project, you're employing someone, what are kind of the general rules that you should consider for when you're actually going to spend time thinking about designing a high-powered incentive contract? You know, when is it better to just decide you're going to monitor this person, or you're going to develop some kind of trust in them and a long-term relationship with them, versus you're going to set up all kinds of fancy provisions to make sure that you don't worry about what they're doing because they already have your best interests at heart. So the first is kind of obvious, that incentives are going to have to be misaligned and direct oversight is going to be hard. It could be that you hire employees, or they have enough equity or stake in the firm that they're going to want to do exactly what you want to do just by themselves. I think that happens probably less frequently than everyone hopes. Everyone hopes that if you hire just the right employee, then the incentives are already aligned. I think there are probably more problems with that than people think, but ideally that would be the environment, is when you just don't have that. So in that case, you're going to want to focus more on hiring the right people or just on directly monitoring them. But sometimes you can't do either of those things, especially if you're at a large firm and you're promoted into a position and you're given a bunch of people that you have to work with, and you can't fire everyone and start from scratch. The second is that employees have to believe that you will honor contractual terms. Now, this is definitely true in my model, that the results, if they didn't expect that you'd abide by deadlines or that you wouldn't pay these completion bonuses, then you really wouldn't get any kind of behavior that you would want. There are other settings that are more subtle, where if you can think about the employer and the employee having an ongoing relationship. Part of the reputation that's established there is the employee's reputation for working hard and doing what the employer wants. The other side of that is that the employer can develop a reputation for kind of doing the things that he says he's going to do. And so rather than having some kind of commitment device that's formal, you can think about this as being enforced by reputation on the employer side. And sometimes that works equally well. But sometimes there are limits to how much you can commit through reputation, and then you get very different sorts of contracts that emerge. And often there are people who study what's called relational contracting, and relational contracting economics is a fancy term for when you can't commit, but you can use reputation. And those have a very different set of lessons, and sometimes the opposite set of lessons. So understanding whether employees, and what's actually important is not whether you can commit, it's whether employees think you can commit. And this can go both ways. If you have very credulous employees, then you can promise them a lot of things that you're not going to give them. Not that I'm recommending that, but that's sort of one side. The other side is that maybe you can commit, but employees don't believe you. And this is actually going to be kind of a caveat to all these sorts of things, is that there sort of has to be some common understanding of why you're writing this contract and what you're trying to do with it. And if employees misunderstand it, that it's kind of obscure and they're not sure why you're putting all these terms in, and they really just don't believe that you're going to do these things, then even if you do and you set up some system to do it and it's not clear to them, you're still not going to get the behavior you want. So this is actually really important to make sure that this is sort of, that you not just commit, but that everyone understands that you've committed. The third, which I think is actually really tricky, much trickier than it seems even from this bullet point, is that you understand what motivates your employees. And I don't mean this in the sort of wishy-washy sense of like people want more than just money and they want like a good work environment and things. I mean that if there are conflicts of interest on projects, that you understand what direction those conflicts of interest go and how big the conflict of interest are. Because for instance, one way that the conflict of interest can go in an unexpected direction is maybe you're afraid that your employee is shirking. And what actually they care about is not that they want less time on the job, but they want to do some empire building, that they want to kind of get employees on their side, or they want to work on a project that will make them look good and will increase their kind of promotion prospects, that sort of thing. And if you write a contract that just tries to be very high powered, they get them to work hard, and they're kind of off doing something completely different, then you may be paying them a lot of money and not getting any behavior that's actually useful to you. So understanding, kind of broadly speaking, what motivates your employees and how their incentives are different from yours is really critical to writing a contract that works. And here we saw that, we had to understand, how much does MBB gain by being employed on this contract longer? And that's actually pretty straightforward because we can see what fees we're paying them and we can kind of see what their profit rate is. You can think about this being used in very different environments though, where suppose that you are a division manager and you have employees that are working on particular products or projects and they're really invested in these. They're kind of emotionally committed to them and they have a lot of power over what's happening in them, and they would much rather stay on this project than get reassigned to something else that might not be as good for them, or that might even be sort of like the first step toward getting managed out of the firm or something like that. And in that case, you know that they care about the project going on, but it's kind of hard to value that monetarily. You can't see what the sort of psychic reward to them from working on this project is. And then it's really hard. You're going to try to set some bonuses that work, but how do you know whether the bonuses are going to be, whether they're going to be way too generous and pay them more than you need to, or whether they're going to be too small? So that's kind of the other side of understanding what motivates your employees, is you really do need to get all these numbers right, or just very bad things could happen. And then the last step is this, as I kind of emphasized in point 2, that employees need to understand how the contract works. This is actually something where a lot of times economists will go out and say, why don't you write this additional complicated term in your contract? And one of the things that managers often come back and say is that people wouldn't understand it and they would not want to sign a contract like that. That they would say, look, you're trying to screw me over some way. I don't like, this isn't standard. You didn't give this contract to anyone else. Why should I sign a contract like this? Give me the standard contract. And I think this is a pretty tricky problem to overcome and something that has to be done with a lot of kind of transparency about the motives and a lot of consistency about how it's applied. But if you're going to try to incentivize employees to do something, they need to actually understand what kind of incentives are being set up. Maybe you have a beautiful contract where if they did what was in their best interest, then they would get more money out of it. And you could think about this as healthcare plan too. Maybe we have this beautiful menu of healthcare plans, and we expect that with certain kinds of healthcare profiles, these people are going to select into these plans. And then they pick all the wrong plans and everything goes to hell. That sort of thing happens more often than it should. And so you have to worry when writing these sorts of incentive contracts that, yeah, when you're writing them, that there's the right amount of transparency here. And enforceability. This is sort of something that when I talk about this with lawyers, they're like, well, this would never hold up in court. Like this, no one's ever seen this term before. It would get thrown out. The judge wouldn't understand it. And so sometimes not only having your employees understand how the contract works, but having judges understand it and having them think this is sort of a conscionable term in a contract is another tricky thing. So this is sort of maybe not the most optimistic appraisal, but I wanted it to be sort of a very balanced one. Where on the one hand, we've seen that, like, look, if you can make all these things work, then incentive contracting can work for you. But there are a lot of things that you need to check before you can make sure that it works. And I think some firms have been able to do this in some circumstances for which it works very well. For instance, I just recently saw a news article about Google X, which is Google's sort of experimental projects arm. And they actually do pay for failure. They don't say how much they pay. This is not very public information. But there have been reports that when they want people to stop working on something that is not going anywhere, then they will actually pay them to get out the project. So sometimes you can solve all these problems and make it work. You just have to spend a bit of time thinking and making sure that you've actually dealt with them. So that's all I have today. I think formally this is scheduled until 1:15, but I wanted to give people time for questions, either kind of online or offline, depending on how we want to do it. But that's all that I have for you formally speaking.
Okay, Are there ever contingencies built into the contracts where it allows the person signing it to evaluate the terms more so after the fact, evaluate the timelines and if they're realistic, and then possibly identify risks to determine, are we signing up for something that we can actually accomplish? That way, it increases, I would think it would increase info sharing at the very beginning and promote the culture of info sharing. And then also they can identify the risks and have a better idea if they can actually meet those commitments.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And this is sort of another environment where there's some uncertainty about what's going to happen, but it's a very sort of rigid uncertainty, and it's just about timelines for particular things. But a lot of times projects are much more complicated. I think a classic example would be when you think about how venture capitalists write the agreements that they have with firms. And often for especially early stage investments, like seed investments, then they'll write all these complicated terms that are basically like covenants that are, okay, we expect that you're going to get this many new customers in the next year, or that you're going to have this many signups for your website, or that you're going to kind of increase revenue this much, that sort of thing. And what happens in practice when those aren't met is not that you default on the contract and we put you into bankruptcy or whatever the kind of equivalent would be. We take whatever remaining assets you have. It's typical that what happens there is that you renegotiate, and you do it in a sort of open-ended way. And in fact, so Oliver Hart, the kind of second laureate on this award, he spent a lot of time thinking about incomplete contracting, where you have that sort of open-endedness, where you don't specify all the contractual terms in advance, and you go and you renegotiate. And you can still make incentive contracting work in those environments, but what you need some understanding of how the terms will change when you end up renegotiating. Because obviously in the environment that I have here, if you want to do something like, look, the project is actually much better than we thought, let's renegotiate this, that creates very bad incentive problems at time zero. And sometimes with that sort of renegotiation, if people think, look, you've invested a bunch of money in us as a VC, you don't want to lose that investment. So really these covenants don't matter that much because we know you're just going to put more money into the firm. And I think that happens sometimes where you write all these things that you think are going to motivate people to do it, but actually renegotiate and it doesn't. And so I think that, yes, you can think about those, and they're important things to think about. I'm not sure I have any lessons for how to deal with them well. Generally, I think of these as sort of weaknesses, that the less that you can plan in advance and you can commit to what's going to happen with those contingencies, the more room you have to kind of let bad behavior slide. The way to think about it being that, look, if someone shirks, you don't learn anything about them necessarily from them shirking. We just may know that that's something that firms like to do, that they like to get away with doing as little work as possible. So then when it comes to renegotiate, how can we credibly say we're going to punish them because we didn't learn anything about them from that? And so that's kind of the trick, is that I think that the more constraints you add, like you add this incompleteness and like you add the ability to renegotiate, the harder it gets to do these sorts of things credibly. And so that's probably the way I would think about it, is, and maybe even trying to say, look, usually we want to leave this open-ended because there's all these unforeseen circumstances. Let's try to narrow how many of those are and try to think about more things in advance to try to get more commitment to doing the right things when it happens. That's maybe the best answer I have to that, but it's a really good thing to be thinking about.
The way you cited the model seems to assume, and I think you get at some of that on this page, that there's information at least about like what the distributions are, what the motivations are. You could imagine a case where PG doesn't know all of that information. For example, they don't know what the distribution of the project lengths would be, or quite what the distribution of the payouts from the projects would be. How sensitive is the model to things like that? Because then they wouldn't know exactly how to set up the contract.
Yeah, so it's a funny thing to think about because everyone has beliefs. To say that you kind of don't know what your beliefs are, that you don't know the distribution, I would think about this rather than this is an empirical thing that we've gone out and measured a bunch of projects and this is usually how long it takes. I would think about this more as this is what PG thinks is going to be the case, that sometimes it's going to take this long and sometimes it's going to take that long. And you can maybe argue that no one has beliefs that are that detailed and everyone takes sort of like worst case reasoning or things like that. And there are people that work in those alternative assumptions where you have what they call ambiguity aversion, where you have some kind of worst case that seems plausible to you and you always operate under those assumptions. If you don't operate under that kind of extreme assumption, then you're going to have either explicitly or implicitly some kind of beliefs about the distribution of returns. Now here what's actually really important is that MBB and PG agree about that distribution. So that may be more the fault point, is that MBB have a really good sense for how long these sorts of things last, and then PG may have a pretty bad sense even right out the gate. And so there's not just, here there was no time zero private information. What happened is MBB learned along the way how good the project was, but it could be also that MBB comes along at time zero with some information about whether it's good or not. So there, the kind of proper thing to do, I want to say the orthodox thing to do from an economic point of view, is to write a menu of contracts. To say, look, we understand that you might know whether this is going to be kind of a long drag-out project with like a distribution that goes way off in several years, or whether this is going to be a short and dry one where you can know how long it's going to take. So we're going to offer you kind of several different styles of compensation or ways of doing the project that are going to allow you to select in. So if you think it's going to be cut and dry, then you're going to kind of take a much shorter horizon and payments that are going to decline more quickly, but a bigger upfront payment, versus one where you're kind of more uncertain about it and we're going to do something more open-ended that's going to be more responsive to good news along the way. So that's kind of the right way to do it. If you're worried about that kind of adverse selection on the types of projects, say, that MBB is going to take. And then you have the additional concerns of whether you're actually doing the selection problem the right way. But I think that's, formally speaking, the way to think about it, is that here we're worried about them delivering us bad news as it comes up. There's always an additional concern about, giving us information up front about how we should expect things to go. And there you have some additional freedom where you can say, look, tell us how you want this to be structured, and that actually gives us some information about, that actually allows us to solve that sharing problem. So that's what you would do. And it's just, it's more complicated, or it's just a different set of problems. And so adding more things on top gives you more of a headache to think about. But that's sort of, formally speaking, how you'd have to deal with that sort of thing.
Hi, I'm just wondering whether the incentive contracting is the best way to do this, because like in China, I was in the consulting business, and the one thing they do is that they hold these auctions where all these consulting companies just come in, and you have a criteria about this project, and everybody just bid on it, right? So people normally choose the most experienced team, which the lowest offering, things like that. So I mean, that's something that works in a perfect competition market. So is that a better solution, or actually incentive contracting is still better in this?
I love this question, because auctions are actually, economists have studied auctions for a long time, and it turns out that what we've decided auctions is there are ways to resolve these asymmetric information problems. So think about a classic auction is you have a bunch of potential bidders who might want to buy a good. In this case, you're actually selling services, but you can kind of think about it the same way. So you have a bunch of bidders who might want to buy a good. They all have private values for how much you're willing to pay for it. No one's going to just go tell the auctioneer how much they're willing to pay, because then they're like, well, okay, go pay us this. So instead what you do is you run an auction where everyone kind of reports some bid. And in fact, the canonical way to get all the information is a second price auction, where everyone reports, look, this is how much I'm willing to pay for the item. You give it to the person with the highest value, and you make them pay the second highest value. So when I think about auctions for these even for services, the asymmetric information problem you're trying to solve there is, partly it's about kind of what the distribution of project returns is, like how long it's going to take, how costly it's going to be. And that's kind of resolved partly by the competition between bidders here. The other thing you're trying to resolve is just some baseline of like, how much is it going to cost to do a project like this? And so auctions are really good. If you have multiple bidders, then that's actually, if you also set a reserve price, then that's the best way to resolve that sort of asymmetric information. It's much more complicated if you sort of don't have competition and you just have one bidder, then you're kind of at their mercy. You can still design a menu of contracts, but they kind of get a lot of what we call information rents and economics out of that. In an auction format, the more bidders there are and the more competition there is, the better you can resolve that problem. So yeah, that's a really good point, that if you can start pitting bidders against each other, then you can extract much more of their information at much lower cost. So yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you.